In the gilded halls of a high-end restaurant, a millionaire's arrogance becomes his gravest mistake when he chooses to mock his waitress in French, a language he assumes she doesn't speak. Unbeknownst to him, Amira, a sharp and brilliant doctoral student, understands every cruel word, transforming his condescending gesture into the perfect weapon. With her quiet resolve and razor-sharp intellect, she begins a silent game of chess, turning his power against him and proving that true intelligence is a currency he cannot afford to underestimate. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The scent of truffle oil and old money hung thick in the air of La Toile, a symphony of opulence Amira had come to know intimately. For 2 years, it had been her second home, a gilded cage where she traded her evenings and a small piece of her soul for the promise of a better future. The polished marble floor, so cold under the soles of her worn service shoes, reflected the shimmering crystal chandeliers above, casting a stark, elegant light on the faces of the city's elite. They came to La Toile not just for the food but to be seen, to be served, to exist in a space that confirmed their status. Amira was part of that confirmation, a quiet, efficient cog in the machine of their indulgence. At 24, her shoulders already carried a quiet weariness that belied her youthful face. Her ambition was a constant, burning coal in her chest, a silent protest against the condescension she faced nightly. She was a doctoral student in comparative literature, her days filled with dense texts on post-colonial theory and her nights spent navigating a different kind of power dynamic. Every eye roll, every clipped command, every dismissive wave of a manicured hand was a data point for her research, a practical lived experience of the system she studied. She saw them as characters in a play she knew all too well, the financiers, the socialites, the tech magnates. They were all variations on a theme, their expensive suits and designer dresses as uniform as her black and white uniform. Tonight was no different. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of silverware. Amira moved with practiced grace, a phantom of efficiency. She could read a table from across the room, anticipating a need before it was articulated. This was a skill born of necessity, of survival. She had learned to make herself simultaneously indispensable and invisible, a paradox of service. Her gaze drifted to table 7, a booth set discreetly against the wall, reserved for one of the restaurant's most infamous regulars, Jean-Pierre Beaumont. The name itself felt like a declaration, a thunderous pronouncement of wealth and importance. He was a man who took up space not just physically but with his very presence. His laugh was a booming, theatrical thing that cut through the refined murmur of the room, and he spoke with an authority that expected no argument. He was a creature of habit, always ordering the same bottle of Bordeaux and a rare seared Wagyu, a man for whom novelty was a nuisance. Amira had served him on more than one occasion and had learned to brace herself for the experience. He was charming in a way that felt like a performance, a superficial veneer over a core of profound, entitled cruelty. As Amira polished the wine glasses for an upcoming service, she watched him. He was seated with an American associate, a younger man with a nervous energy that seemed to clash with Jean-Pierre's effortless arrogance. They were engaged in a low, intense conversation, punctuated by the occasional flash of a smartphone screen. Amira could sense a high-stakes deal in the air, a silent tension humming between them. She knew that men like Jean-Pierre lived for these moments, for the thrill of the transaction, the dominion over others. She found it all deeply, profoundly boring. The hostess, a woman named Genevieve with a perpetually worried expression, approached Amira with a hushed urgency. "Amira, I need you to take table 7, she whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of dread and hope. "Jean-Pierre just arrived with his associates. He requested you specifically." A cold knot formed in Amira's stomach. Of all the people she could serve, it had to be him. She took a deep breath, her face betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Of course, Genevieve," she said, her voice a calm, steady counterpoint to the hostess's anxiety. "Is there a new party coming to join him?" Genevieve nodded, her shoulders slumping with relief. 3 more. A large group. They're due any minute. Amira walked towards the server station, her mind already calculating the logistics, the timing, the sequence of events. She glanced back at Jean-Pierre. He was a lion in his element, holding court, his eyes sweeping over the restaurant with an air of ownership. He was looking right at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. It was the look of a man who saw her not as a person, but as a tool, an extension of the restaurant's service. He didn't see the doctorate, the years of struggle, the sharp intelligence that lay behind her placid expression. He saw only her uniform, her race, and a profound, fundamental assumption of her place in the world. He was about to make a monumental mistake. The moment Amira approached table 7, the atmosphere shifted. Jean-Pierre Beaumont greeted her with a theatrical flourish, a grand gesture of hospitality that felt entirely false. He introduced her to his American colleague, Mark, with a perfunctory wave of his hand. "Mark, this is Amira," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Our best waitress. She's very efficient." Amira's smile was a masterpiece of professional politeness. She handed them the menus, her movements fluid and unhurried. As she did, she overheard a snippet of conversation from another table. A woman was complaining to her partner about the wine list, a small detail about a particular vintage. Amira's mind, always active, registered the information and filed it away. She took their drink orders, her French accent, honed during her year abroad in Paris, entirely absent. She spoke with a clear, neutral American inflection, a linguistic camouflage that had served her well. Jean-Pierre ordered his usual Bordeaux, and Mark, after a moment of hesitation, asked for a glass of champagne. Amira nodded and turned to leave, but as she did, Jean-Pierre leaned in close to Mark and said in a low, conspiratorial French, "You see, Mark? I love coming here. They have no idea how much power we hold. That girl, she is so beautiful, but she has the eyes of a stray dog. A little money, a few nice words, and she would do anything. It's a sport really to see them scurry. The look on their faces when you speak to them in their language is priceless. She probably thinks I'm complimenting her. Pitiful." The words landed on Amira like a physical blow. The insult was so casual, so effortless in its cruelty, that it took a moment to register. He hadn't just mocked her. He had dissected her, reduced her to an object of his amusement, a plaything in his game of dominance. The stray dog comment was a particularly vicious one, a reference to her tired eyes and the weariness she tried so hard to conceal. He spoke with such casual confidence, certain she would not understand a single word. For a brief, agonizing moment, Amira felt a wave of hot shame and fury wash over her. Her hands, which held the wine list, tightened into fists. But then a cold, crystalline clarity settled over her. The words weren't a weapon against her. They were a key, a secret passed to her without his knowledge. He had given her an advantage he never intended, a look behind the curtain of his smug, entitled life. She let the anger dissipate, replacing it with a quiet, methodical resolve. She would not react. Not now. Reaction was for the defeated. She would observe, she would listen, and she would wait for her moment. She walked back to the server station, her face a serene mask, her mind racing. She heard the sound of the restaurant door opening, and a moment later, Genevieve appeared, her face pale. "Amira, the rest of the party for table 7 is here," she said, her voice a little shaky. "3 men from France. Very insistent. They're demanding to be seated immediately." Amira took a deep breath. She had been observing Jean-Pierre and his associate, and she knew the business they were discussing was a major real estate deal. The fact that the other French men were also involved in this meeting meant that she was now privy to a secret that could change the entire dynamic of their deal. It was a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. She picked up the bottle of Bordeaux, her mind already working on a plan. She would not be a tool. She would be the architect of a new reality. When she returned to the table, the 3 new men were seated, their presence filling the air with a fresh layer of European arrogance. They spoke loudly in French, laughing at some private joke. Amira approached the table and poured the first glass of wine. As she served Jean-Pierre, she paused, her hand hovering over his glass. She made a subtle adjustment, a tiny, almost imperceptible turn of the bottle to the left. The motion was so small, so quick that no one noticed. But to a connoisseur, it was a precise, professional move, a sign of her expertise. The motion was a silent acknowledgement, a subtle declaration that she was not what he assumed. Jean-Pierre took a sip and nodded approvingly, unaware of the silent gauntlet that had just been laid at his feet. Amira's smile was real this time, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. The game had begun and she was already 1 move ahead. Amira returned to table 7, her movements still precise, her face still a study in professional calm. The arrival of Jean-Pierre's 3 new associates had changed the table's dynamic, transforming a two-man chat into a boisterous, multi-headed hydra of French business talk. They were loud, jovial, and clearly accustomed to getting their way. Their laughter bounced off the walls, a sharp contrast to the room's usual genteel hum. Amira placed the menus in front of them with a quiet confidence that seemed to momentarily deflate their bluster. She had their drink orders memorized from the first table, and she waited for the new trio to make their choices. As they scanned the wine list, their conversation became a rapid-fire exchange of French jargon and insider jokes. Amira listened, her ears a finely tuned instrument, processing every word. They were talking about the real estate deal she had overheard earlier. It was a massive project in the south of France, and it was clear from their tone that it was a high-stakes, competitive endeavor. The 3 newcomers, led by a man named Antoine, were the key to its success. Jean-Pierre was positioning himself as the indispensable intermediary, the man with the connections and the capital to seal the deal. "He is what do you say, a shark?" Antoine said, gesturing toward Jean-Pierre with a mischievous grin. "He smells the money and he circles. But without us he's just a fish out of water." Jean-Pierre laughed, a booming, self-satisfied sound. "And without me you are just 3 provincial fishermen with an empty net," he retorted. Amira stood quietly, a shadow at the edge of their world, an unseen and unheard observer. Her silence was her greatest weapon. They assumed her ignorance, and in that assumption they revealed everything. She was a ghost in the machine, a fly on the wall, and they had no idea she could understand their every word, their every barb, their every subtle betrayal. Antoine eventually ordered a different bottle of Bordeaux, a vintage slightly older and more expensive than Jean-Pierre's. It was a power move, a subtle challenge. Amira's mind, always active, made the connection. Antoine was not here to be a subordinate. He was a rival, and he intended to let Jean-Pierre know it. This wasn't a team, it was a den of wolves. When she returned with both bottles, she poured a small sample of Antoine's wine for him to taste. He swirled it with a practiced, arrogant motion, sniffing the bouquet with a theatrically serious expression. He nodded approvingly. "Good. Very good. You know, Amira," he said, his French rolling easily off his tongue, "we are talking about something very important here. We can't have any distractions." His gaze flickered meaningfully to Jean-Pierre, a clear jab at his colleague's more casual attitude. Amira's response was a revelation, subtle and deliberate. She maintained her neutral American accent as she spoke to Antoine, but she used a turn of phrase that only a native speaker, or someone deeply immersed in the language, would know. "Bien sûr, monsieur. The wine is perfect for a serious discussion." The use of bien sûr, a small, unremarkable phrase, was just a whisper in the grand scheme of things. But coming from her, a black American waitress whom they had so completely dismissed, it landed with the force of a hammer. Antoine's jovial smile faltered. He glanced at Jean-Pierre, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Jean-Pierre in turn looked at Amira, his smirk gone, replaced by a sudden, intense scrutiny. He had heard her speak before, but always in clipped, functional English. The French phrase, so casually delivered, had thrown a wrench into his carefully constructed perception of her. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. The conversation, once so boisterous, had become subdued. Amira, utterly composed, simply finished pouring the wine and stepped away, her silent presence a lingering question in the minds of the men. She had planted the seed of doubt, and now she would watch it grow. Back at the server station, Amira's mind worked on overdrive. She knew she had to strike again, not with a direct accusation, but with a subtle, calculated move that would exploit the existing tension between the men. She had to weaponize the very language they had used to mock her. Her phone, tucked away in her apron pocket, was a tool not just for her own studies but for the game she was now playing. She pulled it out and quickly texted her contact, a fellow graduate student who was a whiz at business and finance. "I need some info on a real estate deal in the south of France. A company called Viridian Acquisitions. SAP." She knew the name of the company from the conversation. The details she needed were not something she could just Google. They were buried in legal documents and corporate filings. But her friend was a master researcher, and the information would be invaluable. When Amira next approached the table to take their food orders, the atmosphere was palpably different. The 4 men were no longer laughing. They were speaking in hushed tones with nervous glances at each other. Jean-Pierre looked particularly agitated, his eyes darting to Amira every time she passed by. The casual cruelty had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Amira's quiet confidence was a direct threat to his power, and he was beginning to realize it. The game had shifted and he was no longer the one in control. The predator had become the prey, and the silent, unassuming waitress was the hunter. The night was just beginning. The atmosphere at table 7 was now a suffocating weight of suspicion and unease. The casual camaraderie had vanished, replaced by a strained, low-voiced conference. The three newcomers from France, Antoine, Pascal and Louis, were huddled together, their heads bowed, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They kept glancing at Jean-Pierre, their expressions a mix of confusion and accusation. Jean-Pierre in turn sat bolt upright, his usual bombast deflated. He had lost control of the table's narrative, and his every nervous twitch and darting glance was a silent admission of his panic. Amira had turned their easy confidence into a cage of their own making. Amira, for her part, had retreated to the sanctuary of the server station. From her vantage point, she could watch the drama unfold without being a part of it. She finished prepping the salads, her hands moving with their customary efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. Her phone, tucked away in her apron pocket, buzzed again. It was a long text from her friend and fellow grad student. The information she had requested was here, and it was even more valuable than she had hoped. The text was a meticulously detailed report on Viridian acquisitions, the real estate project in the south of France. It wasn't just a simple rundown. Her friend had dug into the local news archives, the public records, and even a few obscure trade journals. The project, a sprawling luxury resort near the town of Saint-Tropez, had hit a major snag. A small, local environmental group had filed a lawsuit, citing concerns about the preservation of a rare, protected wetland on the proposed construction site. The lawsuit, while seemingly minor, had the potential to stall the project for months, if not years, forcing Viridian to renegotiate or face a significant financial loss. Jean-Pierre, it was clear, was attempting to close the deal with his new partners without revealing this crucial piece of information. The lawsuit was his secret, a risk he intended to offload onto them. He was not just a shark, he was a cheat, and his associates were his unwitting prey. A quiet triumph bloomed in Amira's chest. The knowledge was power, but it was also a heavy burden. She had to decide how to use it, how to turn this information into a move that would not just expose him, but also serve her own sense of justice. She would not be a tool, she would be a reckoning. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and began to assemble the first course. The salads were simple, but in La Toile, simplicity was an art form. Each leaf of lettuce, each slice of heirloom tomato, was a deliberate choice. She placed the plates on a tray and walked slowly towards table 7. Her movements a quiet, elegant counterpoint to the nervous energy of the men. As she placed a salad in front of Antoine, his eyes, once so full of a boisterous confidence, now held a guarded suspicion. He was looking at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Amira met his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable. "And for you, monsieur," she said, placing a plate in front of Jean-Pierre, her voice calm and clear. "A simple salad to start. It pairs well with the wine, particularly with its delicate notes of fresh thyme and the earthy finish of the local truffles. A taste of the terroir, you could say." The word terroir hung in the air, a whisper of a word that connected a place to a taste. It was an elegant, almost poetic term, and Amira had used it with a knowing grace that was not what they expected from her. But it was not the word itself that landed the final, devastating blow. It was the name of the town. "I was just thinking about how beautiful this part of France is," Mark, the American, said, trying to break the tension with a bit of small talk. "I'd love to visit Saint-Tropez someday." Jean-Pierre's face tightened. The mention of the name was too close to home. Amira paused for a moment, a subtle change in her posture, her eyes meeting Jean-Pierre's. She let a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touch her lips. "Oh, Saint-Tropez is lovely," she said, her voice a soft purr, her American accent suddenly, almost magically, laced with a whisper of French intonation. "But for the project, I believe you are discussing a different town, no? A place with a much more delicate, natural beauty. I believe the documents refer to a town called Ramatuelle, not far from that protected wetland." The word hung in the air like a phantom, a ghost of the very thing he was trying to hide. Jean-Pierre's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stared at Amira, his eyes wide with a combination of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked at his partners, their faces a mirror of his own shock. They hadn't heard the lawsuit mentioned by name before, but they understood the implications. Ramatuelle was the location of the protected wetland. The mention of it, coming from Amira, of all people, was a direct, irrefutable sign that she knew their secret. Amira placed the final plate on the table and, with a final, serene smile, turned and walked away. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused him. She had simply spoken the truth, a truth he had tried so hard to hide. The quiet, unassuming waitress had become the most powerful person in the room. The real game had just begun. The silence that fell over table 7 was not the refined quiet of a fine dining establishment. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that has just landed but not yet detonated. Jean-Pierre's face was a study in pure, unadulterated shock. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, pale shade of white. His eyes, once so filled with condescending arrogance, now held a frantic, cornered animal terror. He stared at Amira as she glided away, a silent question mark in his mind. How? Antoine, on the other hand, reacted with a different kind of fury. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white against the tablecloth. The other two men, Pascal and Louis, looked back and forth between Antoine and Jean-Pierre, their expressions a mix of confusion and building rage. Amira had just handed them a key to a vault, and now they were realizing they had been lied to. Un problème? Antoine's voice, when it finally came, was dangerously low. He didn't look at Amira as she left, but at Jean-Pierre. A problem with the land? A wetland? You didn't mention any problems. Jean-Pierre finally found his voice, a reedy, pathetic whisper. And no, it's a trivial matter. A small local group. It means nothing. Nothing? Pascal interjected, his voice rising in volume. A lawsuit is nothing? You expect us to believe that? You brought us all the way from France, you set us up to invest millions, and you are hiding critical information. The men's hushed conversation was becoming a full-blown argument, their voices now a sharp, angry buzz. Amira, back at the server station, didn't need to hear their words to know what was happening. She could see it in the frantic gestures, the flushed faces, the way Antoine slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. She had opened a chasm of mistrust between them, and now all she had to do was wait for them to fall in. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Monsieur Dubois, the restaurant's stern, exacting manager, walking in her direction. His face was a mask of displeasure, his eyes fixed on the commotion at table 7. He stopped beside her, his voice a low, disapproving growl. Amira, what is going on at table 7? They're causing a scene. You were speaking with them. Did you say something to upset them? Amira turned to face him, her composure unwavering. I was simply taking their order, Monsieur Dubois. The wine from this evening's selection is of a particular vintage, and I was making a recommendation. Perhaps the gentlemen are having a disagreement about business. Dubois's skepticism was a physical thing. He narrowed his eyes at her, but he knew her to be one of his best employees, a model of quiet professionalism. Still, the scene was a risk to the restaurant's reputation, and he was not pleased. He glanced back at the table where Antoine had now stood up, his fists clenched, his words a fiery tirade of French accusations. Very well, Dubois said, his tone still sharp. Handle their food with extra care. We will not have a scene in my restaurant. He walked away, but not before giving Amira one last lingering look of suspicion. Amira's phone buzzed in her pocket again. This time it was a text from her friend with a screenshot of the official legal filing. She quickly reviewed the document, confirming every detail, every date. It was all there in black and white. She had the proof. A moment later, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Jean-Pierre standing before her, his face a mask of furious, terrified humiliation. He had left his table, an act of desperation that was unheard of in L'Etoile. His associates were still bickering amongst themselves, too consumed by their anger to even notice his departure. He leaned in close, his voice a furious hiss. What did you do? He demanded, his French a venomous whisper. What did you say to them? What do you know about that project? Amira's composure was a steel wall against his panic. She finally dropped the pretense of ignorance. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time she let her carefully constructed professional mask slip. "I understood everything you said, Monsieur Beaumont," she said, her voice a calm, even tone, her French flawless, without a trace of her American accent. "You called me a stray dog. You said it was a sport to see people like me scurry. You said I was pitiful. And you were wrong." The revelation of her linguistic fluency hit him with the force of a physical blow. His face went from pale to a splotchy red. He opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. "I know all about Viridian acquisitions," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet power. "I know about the lawsuit filed by the environmental group. I know you were trying to cheat these men. Your secret is no longer a secret. The only reason it's not a public scandal is because they're not yet aware that I am the one who told them." A cold, calculating fear dawned in his eyes. He realized the full scope of his vulnerability. She didn't want money, she didn't want to expose him to the public. She wanted something far more personal and damaging, to dismantle his world piece by piece, starting with the very deal he had used to mock her. He took a step back, his arrogance completely shattered. He had underestimated her so profoundly that he had unwittingly given her the means to destroy him. His eyes flickered back to his table, where Antoine was now on his phone, likely calling his lawyers. Jean-Pierre knew the deal was over. He was a defeated man. He was about to return to his table and face the consequences of a game he had just lost. The walk back to table 7 was the longest, most agonizing journey of Jean-Pierre Beaumont's life. Each step was a leaden weight, a quiet surrender. The man who had entered Latoile with the swagger of a conqueror now moved with the defeated, broken posture of a boy caught in a lie. His expensive suit felt like a prison, his polished shoes a mockery of his once confident stride. He could feel the eyes of his associates on him, even from a distance, their gazes like burning coals on his back. They were no longer allies, they were judges, and he was already found guilty. When he reached the table, Antoine had put his phone away. His face was a thunderous storm of anger and betrayal. He looked at Jean-Pierre, his expression a cold, hard mask. The jovial Frenchman, so full of laughter just an hour ago, was gone. In his place was a shrewd, ruthless businessman who had just been played. "So, my friend," Antoine said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "A little bird told me you forgot to mention a minor detail. A lawsuit. From a few environmentalists. In the town of Ramatuelle." The words were a direct repetition of Amira's, a final, public confirmation of her knowledge. Jean-Pierre swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Mark, the American, who looked utterly lost, then at Pascal and Louis, whose faces held a terrifying blend of fury and disgust. They had all, in their own way, been victims of his deceit. "It's nothing," Jean-Pierre managed to stammer, a last pathetic attempt to save face. "A small local matter. It will be resolved. Trivial." Antoine's laugh was a sharp, bitter bark. "Trivial? We have our own sources, Jean-Pierre. We have made some calls. That trivial lawsuit has the potential to drag on for years. The company, Viridian, has already been sanctioned by the local government for a similar issue. You brought us here, you promised us a smooth, profitable deal, and you hid the single most important piece of information. You expected us to buy a lie." He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "I would rather deal with an honest enemy than a dishonest friend." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. The sound cut through the low hum of the restaurant, drawing a few curious glances. Antoine didn't seem to care. He leaned over the table, his face just inches from Jean-Pierre's. "The deal is off. And so is our partnership. We will be going elsewhere. And let me give you a piece of advice, my friend. When you are doing business, be careful who you mock. You never know who understands what you are saying." He turned and, with a curt nod to Pascal and Louis, walked out of the restaurant. Pascal paused for a moment, his eyes meeting Jean-Pierre's. He said nothing, but his expression was a clear dismissal, a silent judgment that spoke volumes. He followed Antoine out, and a moment later Louis did the same. Mark, the American, looked at Jean-Pierre with a mixture of pity and contempt before quietly standing up and leaving as well. The table was now empty, the plates of untouched food a testament to a deal that had been broken, a reputation that had been shattered. Amira watched it all, her hands still moving with their practiced rhythm. She had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. She had simply spoken the truth, a truth that had taken down a titan of industry. The silence that now enveloped Table 7 was her victory song, a quiet symphony of consequences. A moment later, Monsieur Dubois appeared at her side, his usual imperious posture replaced by a cautious, almost respectful curiosity. He looked at the abandoned table, at the untouched food, and then at her. "Amira," he said, his voice low, "what happened?" Amira turned to him, her face a serene mask. "They had a disagreement, Monsieur Dubois? About business. It seems they had been misinformed about a certain detail." Dubois's gaze was shrewd. He was a man who knew his restaurant's ecosystem intimately. He had seen the way Jean-Pierre had looked at Amira, the fury and the fear in his eyes. He had heard the final tense exchange at the table. He didn't know what had transpired, but he knew with a profound, gut-deep certainty that Amira was at the heart of it. And for the first time he saw her not as an employee, but as a person, a powerful, silent force to be reckoned with. "Very well," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. "Just clear the table." As Amira walked towards the defeated table, a new kind of power settled over her. It wasn't the kind of power that came from wealth or influence. It was the power of knowledge, of quiet strength, of a mind that had been underestimated and had now proved its worth. She was no longer just the quiet waitress. She was a silent observer, a master of a game that no one else had known she was playing. The night had changed her, and as she began to clear the plates, a new sense of purpose settled over her. The game had just ended for Jean-Pierre, but for Amira, it was just beginning. The quiet rhythm of Amira's night had been shattered, replaced by the chaotic echo of a broken deal and a shattered ego. As she approached Table 7 to clear the remains of a meal that had never been eaten, she moved with a new sense of purpose. The table was a graveyard of ambition. Unopened bottles of wine stood like tombstones, and the untouched salads lay on their plates, a tribute to a victory earned not with brute force, but with quiet intelligence. The air around the table still felt charged, a residue of the explosive argument that had just taken place. She began the methodical process of cleaning, her hands moving over the pristine silverware and crisp linen. As she worked, she could feel the change in the atmosphere. The other servers, who had been watching from a safe distance, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. Before, she had been just Amira, the smart, quiet waitress. Now she was Amira, the woman who had brought down Jean-Pierre Beaumont. The news of the incident would spread like wildfire through the Latoil staff, a legend whispered between shifts. She had changed the power dynamic of the restaurant in a single night, and they all knew it. Their gazes were no longer those of colleagues, they were those of witnesses. Monsieur Dubois watched her from his station near the entrance, his face an unreadable mask. He had always been a man of strict rules and protocols, a believer in the rigid hierarchy of the service industry. But tonight, that hierarchy had been upended. He had seen a waitress, a young woman he had habitually underestimated, outwit and defeat a man who held immense power in his world. It was a paradigm shift that he could not ignore. He finally approached her, not with his usual clipped commands, but with a cautious, almost hesitant tread. "Amira," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "that was a remarkable evening. The way you handled those gentlemen, it was an art form." Amira looked up from the table, meeting his gaze. She didn't offer an excuse or an explanation. She simply accepted the compliment with a small, graceful nod. "Thank you, Monsieur Dubois. I'm just doing my job." He didn't believe her, and he knew she knew he didn't. He looked at her with a new, sober understanding. "I believe there is more to you than meets the eye, Amira. The world of finance, the intricacies of a deal. These are not subjects that most people in your position understand. My position is temporary," she said quietly, her voice still calm and even. "I am a student of literature. The power dynamics of a room like this are just as interesting to me as the dynamics in a great novel." A flicker of genuine admiration crossed his face. He finally understood. He had thought she was a player in his game, but she was a writer, a scholar, an observer. She was studying him, studying his world, and she had just finished a chapter. "Indeed," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I will have to remember that." He paused for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp €100 note. "For your trouble, he said, handing it to her. "Consider it a bonus for exceptional service." Amira took the note, her fingers brushing against his. It was a gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the new reality. It wasn't a tip for service, it was a payment for the unseen work she had done. She thanked him, her voice filled with a quiet dignity, and he walked away, leaving her to finish her work. As the night wore on, the restaurant's energy returned to its normal, elegant hum. The tables filled again and the symphony of opulence resumed. But for Amira, everything had changed. The shame and weariness she had felt earlier were gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of self-possession. The weight on her shoulders was no longer a burden of expectations, but the solid, tangible feeling of her own power. She had outsmarted a millionaire and had done it with the very words and assumptions he had used to belittle her. The act was a reclamation of her dignity. She had not just defeated him, she had educated him, teaching him a bitter, public lesson that some people cannot be dismissed. As she made her final rounds, checking on her tables and ensuring every detail was perfect, her mind drifted back to her thesis. The theory she was studying suddenly felt more alive, more real. The text on the page was a mirror of the world she had just navigated. Jean-Pierre was a case study in entitlement, a character whose arrogance had led to his downfall. She, in turn, was a character in her own story, a hero who had found her voice in the most unexpected of places. The story was hers to write, and as she stood in the center of the elegant room, she knew that the next chapter of her life had just begun. The last patrons of La Toile had finally departed, their satisfied chatter fading into the quiet of the city night. The chandeliers, once a brilliant cascade of light, were now dimmed to a soft, golden glow, and the polished marble floor held the ghostly memory of 100 footsteps. For the first time all evening, the air felt still, as if the entire restaurant were holding its breath, absorbing the weight of the night's events. The usual weariness that came with a long shift was absent from Amira's bones. Instead, she felt a profound, exhilarating lightness, as if she had shed a heavy cloak of expectation and emerged into the cool night air. She moved through the closing rituals with a quiet grace, her hands wiping down tables, her mind a million miles away. She was thinking of the look on Jean-Pierre's face as his world came crashing down, the moment he realized his own hubris had been his undoing. It wasn't the image of a defeated man that lingered in her mind, but the image of her own quiet power. She had not needed to raise her voice or create a scene. She had used a far more potent weapon, intelligence. She had watched, listened, and learned, and in doing so she had turned the tables in a game she had never asked to play. Genevieve, the hostess, approached her, her perpetually worried expression replaced with a look of genuine awe. "I've never seen anything like it, Amira," she whispered, her voice low. "He was so confident. And then you took it all away from him. It was a masterpiece." Amira smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "I just did my job, Genevieve. And in this case, my job was to understand." The words hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the new respect that had been forged. Genevieve didn't press her for details. She knew enough. She knew that she had been a witness to a quiet revolution. As Amira changed out of her uniform, the black and white fabric felt different. It was no longer a costume of servitude, but a uniform of a different kind, a disguise that had allowed her to move unseen through a world that was blind to her. She folded it neatly, a final gesture of a chapter now closed. Stepping out into the crisp night, the city greeted her with a familiar hum. The streetlights cast long, theatrical shadows, and the late-night traffic flowed like a slow, metallic river. But tonight the city felt different. It was no longer a place where she was just another face in the crowd, a small figure in a large, indifferent landscape. Tonight she felt like the main character. The humiliation that had been so casually hurled at her was no longer a burden. It had become a catalyst, a moment that had shown her the true extent of her own power. The walk home was a journey of quiet reflection. She thought about her studies, about the dense theories of power and privilege she had spent so many hours dissecting in books. The incident at La Toile was a living, breathing case study. Jean-Pierre was a caricature of the very system she was studying. A man who believed his position in the world was unassailable, a man whose casual cruelty was a reflection of his own fragile ego. He had seen her as an object, a prop in his life's performance, and in his blindness, he had given her the very tools she needed to bring him down. She was not just studying theory anymore, she was living it. Her experiences were no longer just a backdrop to her academic life. They were a central part of her research. She had found a way to bridge the gap between the classroom and the real world, and in doing so she had found a deeper, more profound meaning in her work. Her thesis would be more than just a collection of ideas. It would be a testament to the power of observation, of quiet intelligence, of a silent woman who had learned to speak in a language the powerful understood. As she unlocked her apartment door, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, she knew that the story of Jean-Pierre was over. But her story was just beginning. The millionaire's mockery had been a lesson, a harsh, unexpected gift. It had shown her that her greatest strength was not in her uniform or her silence, but in her mind. And armed with that knowledge, she knew that no matter where she went, no matter what challenges she faced, she would never again be just the quiet waitress. She would be Amira, a master of her own narrative, a woman who understood everything. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.